Welcome to Part 1 of the two-part webinar, Transition to Adulthood 101 by Maryann Davis, Director of the Transitions RTC. In this section, Dr. Davis answers the pressing question, why focus on youth with serious mental health conditions during the transition to adulthood? She does so by highlighting the overall differences in adult role functioning between young adults with and without serious mental health conditions. Viewers will also gain knowledge about current research in this topic area, with a focus on types of research that are needed to shape successful, age-appropriate interventions for youth with serious mental health conditions.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Maryann Davis. I'm very excited to be doing this, our first webinar, as part of our Transitions RTC. So the first part of this was a little bit as to why we thought it was worthwhile to apply to receive the funding to run a research and training center focused on this population. And in many ways, we felt that this was a truly opportune time to bring folks together to work on the topic of rehabilitation work for young people with serious mental health conditions as they transition to adulthood. We had several lines of evidence that suggested good reasons to do this at this time. We know that this portion of the webinar is going to focus on these 5 main points. So I'm going to go through them very briefly here and then in more detail. First of all, we know that there are large numbers of individuals who are in this age group and in this disability group, that it's a significant portion of our population, an important portion of our population that really needed some help in moving more successfully into adulthood. I say that because we have plenty of data that demonstrates that the development of adult functioning for many of these young people is hampered. That basic findings about how they're doing at this stage of life were really quite alarming when they first came out. Alarming enough to tell us that we needed to do something more, but didn't provide us enough detail to tell us exactly what to do. We also have plenty of data that suggests that there is limited availability of any kinds of services tailored to their needs. And we have, on the other hand, we have very little data from which to construct an evidence base to guide our practices. So those things taken together give us lots of reasons to think that we can do better. The other aspect of why we think we can do better at this point is that there are lots of sort of system-wide factors that are converging. There's an increased focus on individuals who are transitioning into adulthood, both in sort of the general fields of developmental psychology, in the field of disability work, within the field of mental health. I think in general as a society we're recognizing increasingly that this is a critical period of development. It's different from what it used to be in the past. It requires a different way of thinking about it than we have in the past, and that we're starting to move away from only thinking about sort of the time of life that we legally consider to be childhood and the time of life that we tend to think of as adulthood as being sort of these 2 major areas without something in between. And the piece that has emerged from in between is this transition to adulthood, which has also been called emerging adulthood. So what I'm hoping to do today then is to give us a little bit of some background and then some thinking about various aspects about this developmental stage and the context of this developmental stage for these young people that might shape the research that we do together and the knowledge translation activities that we do together. Excuse me. So first, just a little bit of details around the large numbers of transition-age youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions. You'll see CMHC in here as an abbreviation fairly commonly. It's a term that I use sort of as a walk between a term that's fairly common in the children's systems, which has been to refer to individuals in this disability group as having a serious emotional disturbance, and the phrase that is used in the adult system are individuals with serious mental illness. And as a way to sort of combine those 2 phrases and sort of what they capture with that population, we use the term serious mental health conditions. We estimate that there is between 2.9 and 6.5 million 14 to 30-year-olds in this country who have a serious mental health condition. That rate varies depending on who has defined the prevalence rate, which has ranged from around 6% to around 13%. The ones around 13% clearly take a slightly broader view or have sampled in a different way. So using those prevalence estimates, you can say roughly 3 to 6.5 million individuals in this country are in the population of folks that we would like to try to use research and knowledge translation to help. Then we applied those figures to the most recent census estimates for 14 to 30-year-olds to give us some sense of how many individuals currently we might be having an impact on. So I want to start off with thinking a little bit about what we mean by the functional development in young adults. This stage of life is really a very unique one in that it is the point at which we hope to consolidate many of the things that we've been learning about and practicing since we were very young, so that we can move into adult role functioning and be a contributing member of society. This development spans across just about every area of role functioning. The ones that we've listed here are just the beginning of consideration of all those various roles, but we expect people to complete their schooling and training. We expect them to begin to contribute to or to head up a household. We expect them to obtain and maintain rewarding work. We expect them to develop their own social network, to become financially self-supporting, to figure out how you use that income to do the things that you want to do in life. And we expect them to be a good citizen, and with being a good citizen we mean both contributing to society, becoming a voting member, hopefully, but also to avoid the negative things of getting in trouble with the law. So there are a lot of areas in which young people are developing skills and capacities to move into these adult roles. And one of the important things to think about with how these roles develop for young people is that one doesn't move suddenly from being somebody who is dependent on their parents and living at home to functioning thoroughly as the head of their own household. Or we don't move from somebody who knows nothing about working to being somebody who's very successful in working. But all of these functional capacities change slowly over time. And just to give an illustration of that, these are data from the National Comorbidity Study that was a national household survey. These data are from the original one that were conducted back in the late 80s and early 90s. And it was a cross-sectional study where individuals of various ages were interviewed once and asked a whole bunch of questions. One of the sets of questions helped to establish whether they had a psychiatric diagnosis or not. And then the remaining of the questions asked an awful lot about both their experience and their current functioning in life. So taking a look at those data, what these represent were within individuals who had a current psychiatric diagnosis. Essentially, how many of them were, with this blue line, how many of them were in school at the time. And what we can see is that virtually all 15-year-olds in this sample were attending school at the time of the interview, and that rapidly begins to change as individuals move into young adulthood. And the rate of the number of individuals who are attending school tended to stabilize out in the late 20s. So this is one area in which you can see that the resolution of functioning, that is to have completed the role of being a student, changes rapidly, and one could say most people hit a level of maturity or constancy in their late 20s and early 30s. Although I suspect on this phone call we got a whole bunch of outliers of people who continue to do schooling after that. But in general, for most individuals, and for individuals in this particular group, most of that schooling is completed by the age of 30. If we look at individuals moving into their working lives, this red line, we see sort of a complementary but less stable or less constant line of a very rapid movement from not many individuals working before the age of 17, a very big jump up to ages 18 and 19, but increasing numbers of individuals moving into working life in their early to mid-20s. And of course, these two areas of finishing up formal schooling and maybe even informal schooling and moving fully into working life is the heart of the work for this research and training center, trying to figure out the best ways to help people do that with the greatest success. One of the things that we know about this group of young people from studies that have followed individuals who have a serious mental health condition during adolescence and followed them into adulthood is that they tend to really struggle in many areas of adult functioning. The blue bars in this graph represent studies of individuals with a serious mental health condition. The white bars represent either within the same study, a comparison group that did not have a psychiatric diagnosis, or the general population. The gray bars at the top of each of those bars represents the range and findings. So for example, in the first bar, finishing high school, the range of studies that looked at 18 to 21-year-olds and the rate of high school completion within the population with serious mental health conditions ranged from about 23 to 30%. Whereas for the general population or populations without a psychiatric disability, the high school completion rate was between 87 and about 92%. And what we can see for each of these is that compared to peers and peers without a psychiatric disability, individuals who have serious mental health conditions as a population struggle to finish high school. They struggle to obtain and maintain employment. They struggle with having some sort of a safety net around having a place to live. And we see, not that pregnancy is necessarily a bad thing for this age group, but we see much more pregnancy in young women in this population. And this is in combination with data that show that they are less likely to be married than the general population, so suggesting that they're at a very young age taking on parenting, potentially without the support of a spouse. So these are areas in which there is strong indication that we could do better in helping young people move into functioning as young adults. We also have some data on that being a good citizen that suggests that males and females that have serious mental health conditions really struggle during the transition to adulthood to stay out of trouble with the law. Just to walk through quickly, if we look at the blue bars with this, let's see, does the cursor work with this? It doesn't. Okay. The blue bars in here represent, hang on a sec, we're trying to figure out if the cursor, oh, it does work. All right, great. Thank you. So the blue bars represent individuals who were served as adolescents in the case management system for mental health services. Sorry, I'm pausing because the cursor just disappeared. If I don't move it, I think it goes away. Okay, so I have to keep moving it. It's going to be a moving cursor. So these blue bars, males in the darker blue, females in the lighter blue, and the greenish bars represent the general population that does not include individuals who are in the public mental health system as adolescents. And what we see here is that a minority of males have never been arrested out of the public mental health system up to the age of 25. About a little over half of the females have never been arrested. When you compare that to the general population, within the males, that's not such a big difference. Within the females, it's a huge difference. So many more girls who are served by the public mental health system as adolescents have had an arrest history by the age of 25. What we find is that the big difference is not so much in single arrests, so individuals who have been arrested once by the age of 25, but when we look at individuals who have had multiple arrests, we see that the boys who have been involved with the public mental health system as adolescents had multiple arrests this is within those who had an arrest. The majority of them had multiple arrests, where the minority of boys in the general population had multiple arrests by the age of 25. The girls in the public mental health system as adolescents had almost as high a multiple arrest rate as males in the general population, and they also had a much higher rate of multiple arrests than females. So in general, these data show that being involved in the justice system and having trouble with civic functioning is another area in which young adults commonly struggle when they're in the population, certainly at least within this population of individuals who are served by public mental health systems. And then one last consideration about functional roles is to look at the differences between young adults and their role functioning and more mature adults. And with this particular look, we compared 18 to 30-year-olds to 35 to 54-year-olds. Generally speaking, I think people have come to consensus to feel that certainly the adult mental health system, largely the predominant age groups that they serve are 35 to 54-year-olds. The services that are developed are probably mostly considered in light of the needs of that age group. But as these data will show, the functional needs of young adults is quite different from that of mature adults, and highlights one of the reasons that it's clear that we need to make adaptations to many approaches that have a good evidence base in them for use with adults to make sure that they work well for young adults. So if we look at this, we can see that it's much more common for young adults to not be working than for mature adults. It's more common for them to be living below poverty level. It's more common for them to still be in school. It's more common for them to have daily contact with friends. The social life of young adults is quite different from the social life of older adults. And that's also partly reflected in them in a larger proportion of them having not yet ever been married. And these functioning areas have a lot to do with how we shape our services as well. When we think about the social networks, for example, that we might include in trying to help a young person make changes in their lives, we may think a lot more about non-family members than we would have when they were younger, maybe thinking about a romantic partner or good friends. We certainly want to consider spouses when they're there, but primarily they're not going to be involved. So these various aspects of functioning have implications for how we offer our services. One of the other characteristics about the current context of providing services to transition-age youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions is our service systems. We did a study of across the 50 states to ask about the services that were provided within their child mental health system and within their adult mental health system that address the specific needs of those transitioning into adulthood. For the states in which we had responses from both the child and the adult system, we looked at the types of services that were available to see how many states offered those services anywhere in their state. And what we found, I'm actually going to quickly go down to the bottom because to some extent the most important finding is that these data are slightly old at this point. The last data points were collected in 2003, so we would hope that there is some improvement in this, although from monitoring various developments, I think that we still see somewhat of a similar situation, which is that at that time, half of the state's adult mental health systems didn't offer any services that were tailored for the unique needs of their young adult population. That was also true for about almost a third of states' children's mental health systems had not yet developed any services that focused on preparing the young people they served for entering adulthood. And what we see from this is that for any sort of large grouping of services, say, housing that is tailored to the needs of the transition age and young adult population. The majority of states didn't offer that service anywhere in their state. So in general, the characteristic of at least public mental health systems is that the provision of services that are tailored for this age group, for this developmental stage of life, for individuals who have serious mental health conditions, there are few services out there that young people can access. This didn't ask about whether they were good services. It was simply a matter of, did you have any service? So we can see that part of the challenge that we face is trying to populate service systems with more services, and part of our goal for the Research and Training Center is to develop an offering of services that are developmentally appropriate and have good data that they're effective to be offered for states to provide to their transition age youth and young adult clients. One of the consequences of offering services that aren't tailored to the needs of the transition age population is that when we don't make our services appealing to them and developmentally appropriate for them, we think there's a good likelihood that we simply don't capture their motivation to partake of those services. These curves, these lines that we're looking at, are a survival analysis of a large, relatively urban community mental health center. And we looked at the duration of outpatient mental health treatment that various age groups had accessed. We did some statistical things to control for variables like diagnosis and funding source. And controlling for those variables looked at the number of days. We also looked at the number of sessions that individuals accessed in individual outpatient mental health treatment. And what we can see is that the red line that represents 16 to 30-year-olds is markedly lower than these other lines that represent those both younger and older than the 16 to 30-year-old group. And that basically what this shows is that about half of those who started outpatient mental health treatment had stopped their outpatient mental health treatment by about 180 days. For children, half of them had not completed their treatment even 440 days out. So we can see, and also if we compare them to adults, the yellow line, half of them had completed almost 100 more days of therapy on average compared to the transition age youth and young adult population. So one of the risks that we run in offering services that are not tailored to the needs and desires of the transition age population is that they simply don't participate in it. And what good is a service if nobody's participating? So part of what we want to do is to be sure that we're tailoring our services for their specific needs. This next slide takes into consideration what we already have for an evidence base, specifically in interventions that support schooling, training, and working for the transition age population. And for these, one of the things that we can say is that there are some supports that look at adults that have some evidence for them. But what we haven't seen in those interventions is a specific look to see how effective they are for young adults. There are also interventions that have been proven to be fairly effective for adolescents, but there's no evidence to see if those could be extended beyond adolescence. And so this is a summary of the evidence base that's out there that really specifically gets at the issue of are there services that can be either extended beyond adolescence into young adulthood, or that we know are specifically effective with younger adults as compared with older adults in these services or interventions. And what we know based on so the criteria of what are either probably efficacious or well-established interventions, and those terms are used for interventions that have gone through a series of increasingly difficult and complex research-based tests of those interventions to see if they're effective. Are they effective with using a large group of individuals to study? Are they effective when somebody else conducts the intervention, not the person who originally developed it, so could it be generalized to another setting? So there is a series of steps that need to be taken to reach sort of these, excuse me, labels of being either probably efficacious or well established. And at this point, there aren't any interventions specifically for 14 to 30-year-olds with serious mental health conditions that meet that criteria. Some of the best evidence that is out there are for the individualized placement and supports program that is I believe at this point, a well-established evidence-based practice for the delivery of vocational supports for adults with serious mental illness. There is the initial data that is very encouraging that for individuals who are experiencing or have recently experienced their first episode of psychosis, that it's fairly effective at getting them into employment and potentially continuing their schooling. So there have been a couple of randomized clinical trials of this with small n's. So that intervention is on its way to developing a stronger evidence base to suggest that it's a good intervention for that population. For individuals with existing or well-established mental health conditions in this age group, there is no evidence base at this point. For helping individuals complete their secondary education, the one study that is published on a clinical trials type of research base is for the Check and Connect program, which was developed for urban students with emotional disturbance. The population was overwhelmingly male, which is typical of the special education disability group of emotional disturbance. Within the urban population, the group was overwhelmingly African American. It was a randomized clinical trial with 144 individuals in it with very good outcomes. That particular intervention is likely to be undergoing a large clinical trial relatively soon. So that's very encouraging. But when you look at sort of the wide array of needs for supporting individuals as they move from school into their work life during this stage of life, this is a really pretty thin evidence base from which to move forward. And so a big part of what we want to achieve with this RCT, this RTC, too many R's and C's and T's in this, is to really grow this evidence base so that there are more interventions out there around which we have great confidence that they're going to be effective in helping individuals move into their working life. The last intervention that is worth mentioning specifically because it's widely being embraced is the Transition to Independence Process System, the TIP system developed by Rusty Clark and his colleagues, which is primarily a framework of some broad guidelines to consider or to implement for interventions and for systems that if one is starting to develop either a system or an intervention, it's a good place to start looking at for some broad guidelines for consideration of what would be appropriate. Things like the great importance of including youth voice at every level of the system, making sure that services are individualized to the needs of each individual young person, things along those lines. There are no randomized clinical trials that have evaluated the TIP system at this point or dimensions of that system, but there's a lot of supportive data that Rusty and other colleagues have developed over the years to suggest that this is a good framework from which to develop more specific interventions. But overall, the belief is at this point that we really can do better because we have a lot more under our belt to move forward from. So there is some evidence base. 5 years ago, we couldn't have said that there were those two different types of interventions around which we could build from. and there wouldn't have been nearly as much data about systems. There have been a variety of initiatives by the Center for Mental Health Services within SAMHSA at the federal level to support sites that are trying to develop better services for this population that we can learn from. So in many ways, this is a very opportune time for us to take what is out there and develop it much further. One of the things that I'm hoping that we will all come together around is sort of this basic approach of how we develop an evidence base for improving the interventions for this population. And that is, the basic approach is to study various aspects about the population, their context, the environment, these interventions, and use what we learn from those studies to develop interventions or to adapt existing interventions, and then to test those interventions over time. And that is basically the framework for the work within the RTC. So in general, studies that help us shape interventions and adaptations are those that might identify a particularly high-risk group or time of life or time since some event, identify features that are identify features that mandate a tailored approach, so things that make the needs of this population different from approaches that have been used in the past. Studies that identify factors that can be impacted by interventions that should be the focus of an intervention. Studies of the interventions themselves or environments that don't necessarily manipulate them, but study features of programs that work or don't work well for this population. Studies that look at features of the environments that are unique for transition age youth or young adults within their working, training, or schooling lives. Or characteristics of individuals that do or do not do well in existing programs. These kinds of studies all add to our knowledge about how to tailor interventions for this population.